Hey, Retcon Raider here, back with another one of our increasingly infrequent monthly updates. You know, once upon a time these things were actually supposed to be monthly, but that just made a lot more sense back when we were first getting started. Back in the olden days of 2017, when everything felt fresh and new. In large part because I had no real idea what I was doing. These days, though, for better or worse, we are just over 4 years into this whole YouTube thing. The anniversary was a couple of weeks ago. And a lot of this stuff I used to feel was important enough to include in these update videos really just feels kind of run-of-the-mill now. You hit spikes when you start a big new project. You hit lulls when you're 30 episodes deep into an ongoing series. And then you've got the usual seasonal shifts, the summer pickups and the winter slowdowns. Even the annoying stuff, like the constantly shifting YouTube policies and objectionable content guidelines, or the ongoing issues with things like unwarranted copyright claims. They're still annoying, but again, it's really just business as usual. It's the cost of doing business on YouTube, like an annoyance tax. And now that I'm used to dealing with it, it just really doesn't feel like that big a deal anymore. I mean, don't get me wrong, I would absolutely love to not have to deal with that stuff. But that is just not how YouTube works. Anyway, that said, the past couple of months really have just been business as usual. We saw a big spike back in Q1, coinciding of course with the beta launch for games like Solasta and Wrath of the Righteous, but they have since trended back towards normal. It's something we've seen plenty of times, so I don't really feel the need to pick it apart. I will say though, the numbers are slightly misleading, as we've gotten deeper into these more story-driven CRPGs. I've leaned into making longer and longer episodes. Last year, our average video runtime was about 40 to 45 minutes. This year, we've steadily trended towards about an hour per episode, and still rising. And that does, of course, have an impact on the overall monthly analytics. That's not to say that we're not seeing drops in the overall numbers. That was always going to happen as the initial launch hype for Wrath and Solasta wore off. It is interesting to note, though, that the numbers did not drop off evenly, at least not at first. Because I was doing less frequent but longer individual videos, it resulted in less overall views, but more overall watch time per view. The drop-off normalized a little as we got into April and back into the Wasteland 3 series, but again, that's to be expected. Although Wasteland 3 finished pretty strong, Solasta generally outperformed it on a per-episode basis. That said, the average video runtime did continue creeping upward in April, as the Wasteland 3 series got towards its end. We officially wrapped it up a week into May. The numbers on that are looking pretty decent so far, but I do suspect that we'll see a sharper spike as Solasta returns. Now, in theory, I could boost the overall numbers if I started hacking all those hour-long videos into 2 separate half-hour videos, but I'm just not sure that really fits the style of games that we're currently covering. The actual revenue gain for longer but less frequent videos isn't actually all that different from shorter but more frequent uploads. But more frequent uploads do tend to play better with the YouTube recommendation system, which can equate to more overall views because they send more traffic your way. Despite that, however, I really do feel like the slower-paced, story-driven CRPGs are better suited for longer individual episodes. I rarely feel like we've made a satisfying amount of progress in the first half hour, especially in the games where there's a lot of dialogue and lore to get through. I mean, can you imagine an episode where we basically just talk to one guy and then do some inventory management? That would be about 30 minutes in some cases, and I don't think it would make for a very satisfying viewing experience. I would like to get back to doing shorter, faster-paced videos at some point, but I think it's going to be dependent on the type of game we happen to be playing. For now, we're dealing with slower-paced, text-heavy games, but later down the line I would like to get some more XCOM-likes or Battle Brothers clones back into the mix. It's been way too long since I've gotten to draft my viewers and patrons into some sort of certain death scenario. Gears Tactics was almost a year ago. Granted, I did still end up drafting some of my patrons for stuff like Wasteland 3 and Solasta, but that's not quite the same. In those cases, it was just 3 or 4 people for a fixed member squad. I'd really like to get back into something that has a much bigger rotating roster, and preferably with a much higher mortality rate, so I can actually fit some non-patrons in there too. Anyway, that actually brings me to the main thing I wanted to talk about this month. Instead of yammering about the trials and tribulations of an amateur content creator, I thought this month we'd actually change it up a little bit and take a peek at the Retcon Raider watch list. The Retcon Radar, I guess. Yeah, I'm not proud of that one. So basically, you wouldn't know it based on how limited my playlist has been lately, but I do maintain some pretty extensive watch lists. Whenever an upcoming CRPG or strategy game catches my eye, I add it to one of the lists, and I update that list once every few weeks with any significant new developments, any new updates, teasers, or release dates, so I can better differentiate between active and dead projects. The idea, I suppose, is that this will help me decide which potential projects I want to pursue from one month to the next. It also helps me populate my monthly polls. The reality, though, is that we instead tend to get entrenched in these long-running series that kind of end up dominating my playlists. Looking back on it, we've only actually played 4 different games over the past 6 months. Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous, Solasta, Wasteland 3, and insert 4th game here. Baldur's Gate 3. It was Baldur's Gate 3. Man, that feels like forever ago. With that in mind, though, today I thought we'd run down my main watch list real quick and touch on some of the more significant entries. I figure it certainly can't hurt to drive up awareness for upcoming releases you might not be aware of, and to give you a better idea of what games I'm watching and which ones I might like to do videos about in the future, as time allows. That said, even though I have aggressively culled the list, we've still got like 40 titles to talk about, so I am going to try to keep this moving pretty briskly. First up, we've got Amazing American Circus by Clabiter and Juggler Games. Slated for full release on August 12th, but I do believe they just released a public prototype demo with plans for an early access launch. It's a weird one, a roguelite deck builder, where cards represent performers and attractions at an old-school circus that the player is trying to run. I actually backed the Kickstarter on this one, though at a very low tier, largely just because I found the concept so unique that I wanted to see where they were going with it. I will say, I'm actually getting a little bit tired of deck builders. Everyone wants to make the next Griftlands or Slay the Spire, but very few people get even close. But I do give these devs points for novelty. That said, I don't think this looks like it would make for a good video. I do plan on playing it, obviously. I did back the project. So who knows, maybe it'll really end up wowing me. At the very least, I might see about doing an overview or something. Next we've got Arkham Horror Mother's Embrace from Asmodee Games. Just came out in late March, and while I have not had a chance to play it, I do like the art style and the concept, but I have concerns about the overall scope. Generally speaking, I am a fan of Lovecraft-inspired stories and settings, but this game is a loose adaptation of an abstract multiplayer board game franchise, and I often find that those don't make for satisfying single-player video game experiences. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be a bad game, or that it is a bad game, but it is the main reason I've ranked this one pretty low on my list of priorities. I'm a lot more likely to get back to Stygian, Reign of the Old Ones, than I am to jump into something new like this. Then we've got Adam RPG Trudograd, a sequel/expansion to Adam RPG from Adam Team, a game I actually did some videos on back in the day, the original Adam RPG, that is. It was essentially classic Fallout in Russia, a little too simplistic and a little too verbose by modern standards, but not bad. A decent game with some unfortunate subject matter that doesn't play well on YouTube. From what I understand, Trudograd is essentially an expanded follow-up with all sorts of new player-made or player-requested mechanics added to the mix. It actually looks pretty good, and it is currently available in early access with a full launch tentatively slated for Q4 of this year. But I think the big thing holding me back on it is that we never really got all that deep into the first game. I just didn't feel like the first game was paced or laid out in a way that made for good videos, not to mention the content issues. And I'm just not sure how much sense Trudograd would make if we just ended up skipping the bulk of the first game and jumping right into the sequel, which does appear to be a direct follow-up. I do need to give it a proper look, though, so I'll get back to you on that one. Next we have Baldur's Gate 3 from Larian Studios. The first thing I'll say here is that this game has just completely lost traction in my monthly polls. It was struggling to stay in the top 10 even when I was still making videos about it. And now that I've moved on to games like Wrath and Solasta, it has literally dropped all the way down to the bottom of the list, tied for last place as of the May poll. I didn't think it was that bad, but I will definitely agree it feels very wonky. Larian has a very distinctive sense of humor and a very unique approach to CRPGs, and it's something that I'm not sure was a good fit for a nostalgia-soaked IP like this one. In a lot of ways, I feel like they would have been better off if they had just been told to make a brand new D&D-themed franchise, instead of trying to tap into the pre-existing fanbase for the Baldur's Gate series. I mean, think about it. If this game was called Spelljammer, The Invasion of Faerun, would we be as leery as a lot of us seem to be right now? I do still want to play Baldur's Gate 3. I think it's a very pretty and innovative game, if a bit wonky, but I don't know if I'll end up doing it on the channel. We'll see how the Raiders are feeling about it as we get closer to launch. Right now, I'm honestly operating under the assumption that that'll be sometime in 2022, if not later. They still have it listed as launching at the end of this year, but the last significant update for it was back in February. Then we have Battle Brothers from Overhyped Studios. Certainly not something new to the channel, given that I've done 120 videos about it. I keep looking for excuses to return to this game, which is funny because I am not good at it. But I just really like the style and presentation, and there is a fair amount of material from the DLC and the expansions that we just never really got to explore. That said, it is an older game at this point. We actually beat the main game way back in 2018, and it does lend itself to a lot of grinding and repetitive content. I do still have it on my watch list, though, because I am holding out hope that the developers will end up releasing another expansion or two. They did just bring the game to the Nintendo Switch, so I could definitely still see them supporting it with additional post-launch content. There have also been rumors for a while now that Overhype is working on some sort of new tactical game, but we really haven't heard anything significant about that just yet. Next we have Black Geyser from Grape Ocean Technologies, a crowdfunded isometric fantasy CRPG. I actually backed this one too, made a video about it, and I have grown somewhat leery due to the lack of meaningful updates from the devs over the past couple of years. However, their latest announcement was that they had just secured a deal with a new publisher, V Publishing, so that can definitely explain the radio silence. I'm not going to speculate as to why they needed to do that. I assume it was related to funding. I'm just happy to see the project moving again. I think the game looks decent, but now, because they pushed the planned release date so far back, they're up against much heavier hitters like Wrath, Solasta, and Baldur's Gate 3, and I just don't see them winning those fights. Quick name drop on Black Legend from Warcave, a turn-based tactical RPG with a dark fantasy setting and focus on alchemy that pits the player against a deadly cult. It came out on March 25th, so it's already been out for a couple of months now. It looks okay, but I have not actually tried it. I will admit, the initial wave of middling reviews kind of pushed me away, especially with my limited budget and so many higher priority projects currently demanding my time and money. I would like to give it a proper look at some point, but it's definitely a low priority for the time being. After that, we've got Broken Roads by Drop Bear Bites, which is actually one of the more intriguing entries on my current watch list. It's a party-based isometric CRPG with turn-based tactical combat set in post-apocalyptic Australia. That alone was already enough to pique my interest. I mean, Australia is, after all, where the Mad Max franchise first got started. But ignoring that, I've been genuinely impressed by what I've seen so far. The visual style is nice, kind of a combination of classic Fallout and the more modern neon-soaked Shadowrun games from Harebrained Schemes. Turn-based tactical combat is always a plus, even if it does look slightly simplistic. They've also got a modest but fun-looking character perk system and a morality system that's based on philosophical leanings rather than more archaic concepts like good and evil. I do find that intriguing. That said, we don't really have a solid ETA for Broken Roads, but according to Steam, it looks like they're aiming for some sort of launch by the end of 2021. If you're into post-apoc or isometric CRPGs, I'd recommend checking this one out. I certainly plan to. Next we have Colony Ship from Iron Tower Studios. That's the devs who made the somewhat infamous Age of Decadence, and the slightly less known Dungeon Rats. They were kind enough to send me a copy of the EA build currently available on Steam, and I really enjoyed it. It comes across as a blend of like, let's say Underrail and the HBS Shadowrun trilogy. I've got Shadowrun on the brain now. It's an isometric CRPG with complex but surprisingly intuitive mechanics, turn-based tactical combat with controllable companions, a learn-by-doing skill system that actually seems well-balanced, an extensive assortment of gear and weapons to play with, a very intriguing science fiction setting, and an exceptionally harsh difficulty curve, which the developer makes no apologies for. This is, after all, from the makers of Age of Decadence. I actually would really like to do videos on this one, I just don't know if I want to do it while the game is still in EA. Unlike some of the other story-driven CRPGs we've looked at, this one really seems to hit a good balance between action, exploration, and exposition. It is, however, still unfinished and unpolished. You can only get out to the end of Act 1 in the current build, so I kind of want to wait until they get farther along before we jump into it. I might do like an overview or something, or maybe a more casual one-shot gameplay video. I don't know. There are some possibilities there. Quick name drop for Curious Expedition 2 by Machinen Mensch and Thunderful Publishing. I really liked the first game. It was like an exploration-based roguelite with an anachronistic Victorian-era setting. I never made any videos about the first one, but I did play the heck out of it in my spare time, so I had high hopes for the sequel, which just hit full launch back in January. However, the second game didn't really grab me. The first game had a much faster pace, with sort of a roguelite permadeath feel to it, and a heavy focus on replayability. The new game, although much prettier to look at, is a lot more long-winded, with a linear story-driven campaign, a simpler combat system, and a lot less replayability. They are looking at adding a new repeatable roguelite mode, hence why I've still got it on my watch list, intended to better emulate the style of the previous game. And I'm looking forward to that. I don't think it's a good fit for the channel, but it is something I've been playing lately. I might like to do some casual gameplay videos if and when that new mode comes out. Again, as time allows. Next we've got Cyber Knights Flashpoint from the Tracy brothers, developers I have a lot of respect for. And again, I'll say it right up front that this is another project that I backed on Kickstarter. While this is the first foray they're taking into a full 3D turn-based tactical game, they earned a lot of goodwill from me with the extensive post-launch support that they've given to their previous titles like Star Traders Frontiers and Templar Battlefront. I actually made a video about Star Traders Frontiers. That aside, this appears to be precisely the sort of game that I love playing. It's a squad-level turn-based tactical game with a complex character development system, customizable squaddies, and long-term consequences for the player's actions, both on and off the battlefield. It also has a retro cyberpunk setting, a personal favorite, with the player taking on the role of a down-on-their-luck mercenary in the futuristic domed city of New Boston, in a world where, of course, megacorporations have basically taken over everything. Although it might look a bit simplistic at a glance, the devs are no strangers to working on complex, in-depth strategy games, and a quick glance at the prototype job training screen shows that Cyber Knights will not be an exception to that, with 15 different character classes, each sporting a 3-pronged node-based perk tree to allow for multiple mixing and matching in their various specialties. There will be a wide assortment of equipment, modular weapon upgrades, cybernetic implants, an upgradable base, remote control drones, and even cybered up dog and cat companions for the Hund and Assassin jobs, respectively. Add on top of that the fact that the game will allow for a custom crew of chromed up ne'er-do-wells that I can rename after my viewers and patrons, and that it will use a character evolution system and an injury system that will grant those disposable characters more, character and depth, and it is pretty much a perfect fit for the type of video I like to make. Sadly, although this is a game I am very much looking forward to, as evidenced by the fact I've been talking about it for like a minute straight now, it won't actually be hitting launch until sometime late next year. They do have an early access launch tentatively slated for Q2 of next year, as well as a closed backer alpha for the end of this year, but it is going to be a while before I can really get into it. Next we've got Dark Envoy by Event Horizon. Looks to be another party-based isometric CRPG with a fairly eye-catching art style and a fun science fantasy sort of steampunk setting. I'll admit I'm on the fence with this one. When I originally added it to my watch list way back in 2019, it was originally being pitched as a turn-based tactical CRPG. A little generic, very XCOM-like, but definitely more in my wheelhouse. Now, though, they seem to be going all in on a turn-based stealth mode, but with a real-time combat system once you get past the turn-based planning phase. It will apparently feature tactical pausing and the ability to slow down time while you're watching things play out, so you have more time to react to sudden changes. But I'm always going to find turn-based tactical mode more appealing than real-time with pause, no matter how you dress it up. That's not to say it's going to be a bad game, it just bumps it farther down on my priority list. I do still plan on keeping an eye on it though, and I do hope it turns out to be a great game. It'll still be a while. The current listed release date is 2022, so, you know. Then we've got a big one, Darkest Dungeon 2 by Red Hook Studios. This is, of course, a property I have a real love-hate relationship with, and I did actually back the first game on Kickstarter. It was one of the first projects I ever backed. Well, technically, like the 12th after Wasteland 2, Pillars of Eternity, Shadowrun Returns, StarCrawlers, and a bunch of other games that never ended up coming out, but you get the idea. I also did a 50-episode series about the first game, so I guess I should touch on that real quick. I still get a fair amount of people asking me about it. It is still on my list of potential projects I would like to complete, but it is also still tied up with copyright issues. I have had more issues with copyright claims on that series than anything else I have ever done combined in the past 4 years. And honestly, I have no idea how to fix that. That said, the developers have reassured me that copyright claims will not be an issue with the upcoming sequel, so I'm definitely keeping an eye on that one. They put out a couple of teaser trailers. We know that it's going to be loosely inspired by At the Mountains of Madness, and they've indicated that they're sort of moving away from the village-based gameplay loop. The hamlet is destroyed in the opening of the teaser trailer. But we don't really know much beyond that. I'm definitely intrigued, even though the previous game did give me like 7 heart attacks and also may have turned me into a vampire for a while. But, you know, I still had fun with it. The earlier teasers and announcements, some of which are a couple of years old at this point, did indicate that they would be hitting an Epic exclusive early access launch in Q3 of this year, with the game then going to other platforms once they hit full launch sometime after that. I've already got an Epic account. I use it for various other things, most recently to check out the new builds for Phantom Brigade, so I could definitely see myself checking out Darkest Dungeon 2 when it comes out. I mean, I did say I was jonesing for a squad-based game with customizable characters and a high mortality rate, right? Right. Empire of Sin from Romero Games and Paradox Interactive. I'm going to keep this one short. I had high hopes for that game, and it disappointed me. I love the noir setting. I love the concept behind it, but the game should not have been released in the state it was released in. Now they're scrambling to try to fix it, but I really feel like it's just too little too late. I am going to take a look at whatever the game turns into, like a year from now, but I really don't think they're going to make up for what was a pretty catastrophically bad launch. Still on my watch list for now, but I don't think I'm ever going to do any videos on it. Moving on. Encased RPG from Dark Crystal Games and Black Tower. Yet another retro isometric CRPG that I backed on Kickstarter. I've talked about this one before. It's a post-apoc setting with heavy science fiction elements and turn-based tactical combat, currently available on early access over on Steam. I've played through the current build, and while it's definitely unfinished and very rough around the edges, I can see a lot of promise there. Fair warning though, once again this is a crowdfunding project where the devs have started pulling a lot of flack for repeated delays and poor communication. They did just recently announce that they had signed on with a new publisher, and that the new round of delays were so that they could use that extra funding for more content polish and full voice acting for all of the game's extensive in-game dialogue. I am giving them the benefit of the doubt right now, but I'll continue monitoring it. After that we've got a new addition to my list. Expedition Rome. I don't know much about that one. I just added it to my list last week, but it's the third game in the Expedition series from Logic Artists and THQ Nordic. The previous two games were Expedition Conquistadors and Expedition Vikings, both of which I do own. I never really got a chance to play the first two games as much as I would have liked, but I will say it looks like they've made some pretty steady improvements from one game to the next. Like the first two games, this one has elements of both an overland exploration simulator as well as a turn-based tactical CRPG, but they're also adding unique story-driven companions, a fully voiced narrative, and new mechanics for diplomacy and war to better simulate the expansion of the ancient Roman Empire. I generally prefer fictional settings to reimagined historical, but I do think this one looks pretty solid so far. The release date's a little vague, sometime in 2021. Next we've got Fabled Lands by Prime Games. This one actually hits early access on May 20th, so almost immediately after I'm recording this, and I am intrigued, but leery. It's apparently an adaptation of an old series of solo adventure game books from the mid-90s, but retooled into a single-player open-world adventure game. The player can explore, trade, join guilds, engage in diplomacy, or just go on adventures and die in a cave or something. I'm not really sure what to think about this one. I actually really like the concept and the art style, but I also have a really hard time wrapping my head around the idea of adapting a series of choose-your-own-adventure books into a completely different format. That said, I'm definitely curious, so I'll probably end up picking it up at some point. I'm just not sure when, given that we're right on the cusp of a bunch of other bigger game launches. Gamedec by Anchar Studios, another crowdfunded game that I backed on Kickstarter. I find this one fascinating. It's essentially a non-combat adventure RPG where the player takes on the role of a futuristic detective tasked with solving crimes related to an advanced full immersion version of the internet, which is in fact a waking nightmare. Apparently it's based on a series of books that I'm not familiar with, but they do sound intriguing. They do have a couple of backer betas out, with full launch slated for September 16th, and I do find it to be a very interesting game. I played the first of the two backer betas, but I avoided the second one because apparently it was very spoiler heavy. And it was a very surreal but engrossing experience, which unfortunately also skirted a lot of themes that would definitely get it demonetized on YouTube. I do plan on playing it, but much like with Disco Elysium, I just can't afford to spend time making videos that are likely to be demonetized, or that even worse, might end up violating YouTube's constantly shifting objectionable content guidelines, so it is what it is. Griftlands from Clay Entertainment. I think I name-dropped this one earlier, and it's a game that I have had a lot of fun with in early access. They're about to hit full launch in the next month or two, and it's easily one of my favorite deck-building games on the market, right up there with Slay the Spire. It's a story-driven deck builder that takes place in a backwoods science fiction setting where the player takes on the role of one of 3 colorful grifters, each of whom has a story-driven campaign where they're looking for some mixture of fortune or revenge. The gameplay loop is very unusual, with the player building and maintaining 2 separate decks, one for physical combat and the other for verbal debates. The combat aspect is pretty straightforward and very reminiscent of Slay the Spire, but the dialogue combat is really where the game shines. There, the player can use various cards to persuade, intimidate, or manipulate their opponents into submission by methodically destroying their defenses, which represent the opposing arguments. I will admit, as much fun as I've had with it, it does tend to get pretty repetitive, and I question how much replayability there is once you've finished the 3 main scenarios. It hasn't really gained much traction in my monthly polls, which is fair because I'm not sure it would really make for great videos anyway. I might still see if I can do an overview or a one-shot casual gameplay vid at some point, but as with a lot of these other games, that's definitely a lower priority. King Arthur: Knight's Tale by Neocore Games. This one's gained some decent traction in my recent polls. It's a story-driven CRPG with turn-based tactical combat and a grimdark setting, loosely inspired by Arthurian legend. It's currently in early access, and I did actually pick up a copy a few weeks ago. I just haven't had time to actually play it, but it is on my to-do list. That said, I've also noticed that there hasn't been much movement on it since the game first hit early access back in January, and the one major patch they had in February did a lot of hefty rebalancing, so I haven't really prioritized it. As with a lot of the other games on my current watch list, I'm kind of taking a wait-and-see approach while they fine-tune that first early access build. I'll toss in a token nod to Mechajammer, formerly known as Copper Dreams, from Whalenut Studios, the makers of Serpent in the Staglands. I have no idea what to expect from that game at this point. It was originally supposed to be a turn-based stealth RPG with a cyberpunk setting and chainsaw arms, but now appears to be a chaotic, squad-based, simultaneous action game. I've waffled on this one a few times since I first started following it back in 2016. The developers keep going quiet for long stretches and then popping back up with what looks like a completely different game. This latest iteration looks messy but intriguing. I do really like the Studies and Virtues dice-based character system that they described in the Copper Dreams update number 30 over on Kickstarter. However, I should stress that that was last October, and they have gone completely silent again since then. No ideas if and when this game is ever going to come out. Supposedly it is in closed beta right now. But for now, it has a tenuous space on my watch list. Oh, Necromunda Underhive Wars. Rogue Factor and Focus Home Interactive really dropped the ball on that one. I was really anticipating that game because I used to love playing the original tabletop Necromunda back when I was in high school and college. Delaque was my house of choice, and although I ended up losing a lot of my old gaming books in a flood, I used to have just about everything they had ever released for this game. Sadly, this adaptation just wasn't good. It's visually stunning. They got the look right, but it's very much an example of all flash with no substance. The gameplay loop is simplistic and repetitive. The gangs are too small, the pacing is too slow, and the AI is just downright awful. I don't say that lightly, because I played a lot of bad games and still ended up enjoying them. But in this case, enemies were often more a danger to themselves than they were to anyone on my team. It got to the point where I would just get up and leave during enemy turns, and do something else and come back to see what had happened. I once watched an enemy ganger spend an entire turn just methodically putting down frag mines, only to immediately forget where they had put them and then walk into them over and over again, until they eventually bled to death. They really wanted out of that game. The dev team did initially make some noise about trying to fix the game post-launch, but that seems to have stopped back in February. I have heard that the dev team has since been disbanded and reassigned, so I think they just talked this game up as a loss. All attention seems to now be on this new action-oriented Necromunda first-person shooter. I wish I could say otherwise, because I do love the original Necromunda, but I just cannot see myself doing anything with this. Side note, they never ended up releasing House Delaque. It was the one of the 6 core gangs they did not provide support for. Cool. Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous by Owlcat Games. Do I really have to go into this one? I feel like we're all familiar with it. The backer beta is currently available. They just dropped a big update 2 weeks ago, and I just got the series moving again. Aside from this video, I'm actually also working on Wrath Beta Episode 25, which will largely focus on new content that they just added into Act 1. One thing I should note, however, is that the developers have doubled down on hitting full launch by September 2nd, which really caught me off guard. Based on my experience with other crowdfunding games, Kingmaker included, I honestly expected the game to be pushed back into next year. I thought we were going to have plenty of time to run through a bunch of the content in the current beta, and then also go and wrap things up with the old Kingmaker series. But now I'm not entirely sure how I'm going to end up parceling out my time. Given that they are aiming for a full launch less than 4 months from now, I'm not sure how much longer I'll be running the beta series. It still gets good numbers and has a death grip on the #1 slot in my monthly polls, so I am sticking with it for now. But there is going to be a point where I'll need to pull the plug on it so I can start prepping for the full launch build. I'm not exactly sure how I'm going to approach that. I also have other projects I'd like to make time for, but I will figure that out as we get closer to September. I'll probably end up running some polls. Phantom Brigade by Brace Yourself Games. Currently available in early access over on the Epic platform. I did a couple of videos on that one, but at this point they are woefully outdated because the developers ended up completely changing the entire combat system. I will admit the decision to move away from conventional turn-based tactical combat and into this sort of turn-based simultaneous action system really put me off at first. That said, I have since gotten back into it, and it actually really works. It's a little chaotic, but you get used to it pretty quickly, and it certainly makes the battles feel a lot more fast-paced and dynamic, which is probably a better match for the anime-inspired mech and character designs. One of my biggest problems when it came to BattleTech was how slow, plodding, and repetitive the battles tended to get. I understand they were trying to simulate how massive and lumbering these building-sized war machines actually were, but it got old pretty quickly, and cranking up the animation speeds just made it look silly. That is not an issue with this new version of Phantom Brigade. I actually really like the new combat system, but they have not yet implemented any of the actual campaign or progression stuff, so I'm not going to do anything with it just yet. Well, you know, I might actually do an updated overview or a one-shot gameplay vid or something. I do feel like I should probably make it clear that my old videos do not represent what the game is actually turning into. I'll have to give that some thought. Oh, Phoenix Point Festering Skies from Snapshot Games. I may have mentioned Phoenix Point once or twice in the past. I backed the crowdfunder, I started some sort of YouTube channel to talk about it, and I did play through the main campaign, minus the current DLC. This is the first big expansion they're releasing for the game. I have been anticipating it for a while, but I will also say I was kind of hoping for more. I don't think it looks bad, but it's definitely not what I was expecting, which honestly I think is Phoenix Point in a nutshell. The air combat system looks very limited, and forcing players to use their troop transports as interceptors just seems like a bad idea. The old roadmap and early concept art implied that they were originally working on 3 different air vehicles for each main faction, including dedicated interceptors, so I'm not really sure what happened there. I have to assume it was due to budgetary or time constraints. However, I will say, it is nice to finally see the behemoth in the game. The new Infected Haven scenario was unexpected and actually looks pretty interesting. And I do like that we have a couple of new enemies to fight. Though at the same time, I also wish the Myrmidon, I think it's called, looked more monstrous. I know the ship has long since sailed, but I do really miss the old Eldritch body horror. I will say, Phoenix Point is still on my list of potential projects, and it gets some modest support in my monthly polls. But I'm just not sure that Festering Skies is going to be the game changer that I think a lot of us were hoping for. I will give it a closer look when it comes out on May 25th, but that's right next to the launch for stuff like Solasta and the new Wasteland 3 expansion. While I would like to run through another season at some point, I might just end up waiting until they've put out those last couple of DLCs. Then we can check out all the new stuff at once. Okay, let's see here, what else? Realms Beyond, Ashes of the Fallen by Series Games. Another project I backed. It was a very retro turn-based CRPG, using a custom fantasy setting, but the familiar D&D 3.5 open game license rule system. While certainly not the prettiest or most modern game, I did find a lot of the concepts and mechanics appealing, but sadly it looks like this one did not survive the crowdfunding development process. The developers went completely silent about a year ago, just after they released the first combat beta, and since then their website and forums seem to have disappeared as well. That said, I am keeping this project on my watch list, but I've got it tagged as probably dead because I am not expecting it to come back. It's unfortunate, but that is what happens with a sizable chunk of low-budget indie games that get funded through sites like Kickstarter or Indiegogo. You take your chances when you back them, and at least in this case, I'm only out like $20. I wish the game had come out. It sounded interesting, but it happens. Next we've got Solasta, Crown of the Magister by Tactical Adventures. Again, I don't think we really need to go into this one too deep. I backed a Kickstarter, made a video about it too, then also did a one-shot video about their original prototype demo, and like 20 episodes about their early access build. I love this game, as janky as it might be, and we are definitely going to be jumping back on it as soon as it comes out on May 27th. For those of you who are for some reason unfamiliar, Solasta is a turn-based tactical fantasy CRPG using the D&D 5th edition license, similar to Baldur's Gate. It also has a granular focus on dungeon crawling and unconventional three-dimensional movement, and a very amusing personality system for your custom-made party members. I know some folks won't be able to get past the low-budget aesthetic, and I will be the first to agree that some of the faces are just weird. Unfortunately, it is just a necessity of an ambitious, low-budget indie game. But I personally think that they have made a fantastic game with the resources they had available. And I give them full props for running a fantastic crowdfunding campaign as well. Having backed literally dozens of crowdfunding campaigns at this point, maybe over 100, I've had a lot that I've been unhappy or ambivalent about. See Realms Beyond. But this is one of the rare exceptions. I hope this game is successful enough to allow Tactical Adventures to continue making games. More Solasta, or whatever else they feel like working on. If they do end up running another crowdfunder in the future, I will not hesitate to back it. At any rate, I hear the full campaign is about 40 hours long, so we're going to have about 20 more episodes to get through once we resume the series at the end of May. We are going to be picking up pretty much where we left off. We'll be using a slightly tweaked version of our old party, with some new loadouts, necessitated by the RNG-based loot system, and we will be playing that game to completion. That's likely to be the next big project I finish. They're also launching with built-in mod support and Steam Workshop, so even after the main campaign is over, there is potential for further adventures beyond that main campaign. But it will, of course, depend on the quality of any user-made content that we do end up seeing. Alright, we're running a bit long here. We're past the 40-minute mark, geez. So let's speed this up. Space Wreck by Paris Entertainment. Paris? A very retro isometric CRPG inspired by classic games like Fallout, which takes place in space. The player takes on the role of a survivor on a spaceship after a pirate attack. The passenger ship is stranded and everyone's going to die unless the player can somehow repair the ship's core systems enough to get the ship moving again, which requires exploring other nearby derelict ships, scavenging the ship's remaining systems, and potentially facing off with all sorts of hazards. Hostile creatures, old security systems, more pirate attacks, and even your increasingly irrational fellow survivors. I like the look of this one. I like the concept, and while the visual style is probably a little too retro for most, I actually find it quite appealing. I like the rule system, which seems to be loosely inspired by the GURPS role-playing system. Well, maybe. It's D6 based. There is a turn-based tactical combat system. It looks pretty decent, but the player will be able to approach most problems in a variety of different ways. The game will be hitting an early access launch on July 2nd, and there is actually a free demo already available. Again, might be too retro for a lot of people, might be too retro for videos, but I do think it looks good. Next up is StarCrawlers Chimera, the kind of sort of sequel to the original StarCrawlers by Juggernaut Games. I backed the original game on Kickstarter, even did some videos on it way back in 2017 that I'm not really proud of, but this sequel feels like a completely different animal. It's got a much more quick play roguelite look to it. Instead of a whole squad, you just control one character. Instead of a campaign broken up over multiple smaller missions, it looks like you just have one mission this time, but it takes place in a massive, randomly generated lab complex. The combat's still turn-based, but it's much faster paced with less menus and what looks to be more of a streamlined point-and-click interface. Once again, not really sure what to think about this new take on the franchise, but they are apparently planning to launch a Kickstarter campaign later this month, so I'll definitely give that a look. They're also planning on doing an early access launch on Steam later this year, but that may or may not change, depending on how things go with that crowdfunder. Stellar Tactics by Maverick Games. I don't think I've ever talked about this one before, but it has actually been on my watch list ever since I first started the channel. It's a science fiction CRPG with turn-based tactical combat, real-time ship combat, granular crew and ship management, and a lot of procedurally generated contracts to pursue. I don't think it's well suited to my usual type of videos, and the game is kind of dated at this point. It's been in various stages of early access since 2016. Still, I give full props to the developer, singular, which I think is just one guy who's been continuously expanding and fine-tuning an incredibly ambitious game pretty much non-stop for the past several years. Whether you like the game or not, I can absolutely respect that kind of commitment and dedication. I am curious to see what the game ends up looking like if and when he ever finishes it. StoneShard by Inkstains Games and Hype Train Digital. Yet another game I backed, and currently available in early access on Steam. This one's a turn-based roguelite dungeon crawler with survival elements and a particularly harsh and unforgiving injury system. The idea behind it is supposed to be that you have disposable heroes, but a persistent caravan that each of your heroes is working to expand and improve. The groundwork they're laying is pretty solid, but development has been moving a lot slower than I think the devs anticipated. They're still getting a lot of the basic framework in place, adding in core skills, more gear, more enemy types and quests, with the next major updates adding the second main quest hub to the game. Definitely not ready for prime time just yet, but it's getting there. A slow-moving project is certainly preferable to one that has stopped moving entirely. So, as with many of the other games on my watch list, I will continue keeping an eye on it. Terra Invicta by Pavonis Interactive and Hooded Horse. This is the grand strategy game coming from the folks who developed the well-known Long War mods for XCOM and XCOM 2. It's essentially a very granular simulation of running a semi-secret global organization, in an attempt to exploit, enable, or avert an impending alien invasion. I did back the crowdfunding project, and I do have access to the closed backer beta, but I'm not sure if I'm actually allowed to talk about specifics here. Suffice to say, it is both exactly what I expected it to be, and also exactly what I feared it would end up being. It is to XCOM what Football Manager is to actual football. I know there are probably people who enjoy that sort of thing, though I am not sure that I'm one of them. That said, I can still see that they clearly put a ton of exhaustive effort into this project, which I respect, and I'm also happy to help support the team that created Long War. The game is currently in closed beta, with a tentative release date sometime later this year. The Iron Oath by Curious Panda Games and Humble Games. Yet another indie game that I backed on Kickstarter. Originally pitched as a more stylized, story-driven take on the Battle Brothers formula, with pixelated art, I've kind of fallen out of love with this one. I initially found the concept fascinating, but development has been moving at a crawl, and I wasn't really impressed with the prototype demo they released a few months back. I do want to give them a chance. They recently signed on with Humble Games to secure more funding to continue development, and I am curious to see what the final product looks like. I don't think I'm going to talk about it much until then, because seriously, at this point, they've already overshot their original intended release date by 2 years, with no new target date in sight. But they are still moving. Again, as with StoneShard, I backed the project, I want to see where they're going with it. Even if it is not exactly what I imagined, I am curious to see what the developers end up putting out. The Magister by Nerdook Productions. I'm not actually sure what happened with this one. I did a really casual couple of gameplay episodes based on an early beta of that game like half a year ago, and the game is still not out, and there's no fixed release date on it. It's like a semi-procedurally generated murder mystery in a dark fantasy village. The player takes on the role of a magistrate who is sent to investigate a murder. They have to gather clues and loot, build their power, eliminate suspects, and eventually correctly accuse the person who committed the murder and resolve the case. The game is designed with replayability in mind, and the version of the game I played seemed like it was really close to being finished. I'm not sure why it's not out yet. I believe there is still a public demo available, but that is capped at the end of day 2, so you can't actually finish your investigation. I did actually record like 4 more episodes with a version of the beta that I had, which is no longer available, where you could complete your investigation. I just never ended up finishing that particular series because I ran into some copyright issues, and I also had some other bigger projects on my plate at the time, so I just never got around to trying to fix it. I might go back and finish that at some point, or maybe not, I don't know. I mean, I have the footage, I would like to do something with it, so who knows, maybe if I someday find myself with a surplus of both time and energy. Vagrus, The Riven Realms by Lost Pilgrim Studios, one of the only games I backed on Fig. They were on Fig, right? Man, it has been ages since the last time I looked at Fig. Anyway, I backed the project and I do have access to the current early access build, which you can also get over on Steam. It's a post-apocalyptic fantasy exploration and trading simulator, with the player taking control of a struggling caravan and trying to make ends meet by trekking from settlement to settlement in a world that was just absolutely wrecked by an arcane apocalypse. I like the art style. The writing is really good, if a little too voluminous. But I will also admit that I have not actually had time to play it since the original story-driven tutorial campaign. I've heard a lot of good things about the newer open world campaign, and a lot of the newer, more granular mechanics that they've been adding over the past several months. I keep meaning to go back and check it out. I've just been too busy with other projects. So, you know, one more thing for the to-do list. Not sure it would make for a good series, but I do plan on giving it another look. Wasteland 3, The Battle of Steeltown. In Exile Entertainment. Or just In Exile these days, apparently. I do want to do this. It's obviously a higher priority project, but it's also a slightly lower priority than Wrath or Solasta at the moment. We probably won't be jumping in right after the release, but I will start doing some research and prep work as soon as it comes out on June 3rd. I have a sneaking suspicion that this is going to be a largely self-contained expansion. The developers seem to have deliberately left the entire southwest corner of the world map empty just for the Steeltown stuff. I am hoping that the expansion will also include some other cut locations, like the Dunes or NORAD, but I'm not holding my breath. We haven't seen anything like that in the current teaser material. They're also adding a few new mechanics alongside the expansion, like the new kennel and the crafting systems. But I know that at least some of that stuff will not be backwards compatible with our old save files. We can still just play without it, but I'd hate to skip all that crafting stuff just because that system didn't exist back when we played through the original campaign. I'm not entirely sure how I'm going to approach that just yet, so it is one of the things I'm going to have to take a look at. We also know the developers are apparently planning at least one more expansion, though we know nothing about it just yet. It's possible that that one might also include elements that aren't backwards compatible with pre-existing campaigns. It might even tie into Steeltown somehow. So it does give me some pause about rushing into this first expansion. If it turns out that Steeltown is a short, self-contained expansion, then I might just bite the bullet and see if I can jam through a quick little 4 or 5 episode miniseries. If it turns out it's something more involved, especially if it ends up hooking into another piece of future DLC, then I might end up having to take a step back while I rethink how I want to deal with it. As for the main game, I had this whole sort of series post-mortem I was going to do. Originally, I was going to yammer about it while the credits were rolling, but I didn't want to talk over the music. It really would have kind of killed the gravitas of the ending. I was going to talk about it here, but at this point we are an hour deep and my throat is starting to disintegrate, so I will try to keep this simple. I think that Wasteland 3 is the best game that In Exile has made. However, I also think that it's severely hampered and held back by a lot of the usual quality control issues that you do tend to see with pretty much every In Exile game. Don't get me wrong, it's a truly fantastic and surprisingly intricate story wrapped up in a decent game, and supplemented with a phenomenal soundtrack. But it feels rushed and incomplete. There's all this blatantly cut and unfinished content with clear placeholders and obvious references to things that just didn't end up making it into the launch version of the campaign, and we don't know if they'll ever actually be added. I love the game, but it is also frustrating to me every time we end up seeing a character arc or plot thread just suddenly stop for no apparent reason. I hate that there are characters that should have had more significant roles, like Doc Parker or Gideon Reyes or Tourmaline. Tourmaline's not even in the game. I hate that they had all these really ambitious plans, like the multi-tiered vehicle system and the granular base upgrade and reputation system, which really ended up getting streamlined and simplified in the launch build. There are still vehicles, but it's just the one, and there's still a reputation system, but come on. That thing's basically just a camouflage for a set of binary toggles with a single major decision, usually deciding whether or not a faction will end up liking you. You know what, I feel like I'm being too negative because I really do love the story, and I don't regret backing the crowdfunder over on Fig. But much like with Phoenix Point, it's difficult to look at what they originally proposed and then match it up with what we actually got. That said, I will also note that I don't generally get this worked up, unless it's about a fictional property that I am really passionate about. So, I mean, that puts Wasteland 3 in good company, right up there with games like Phoenix Point, Dragon Age, and pretty much the entire Fallout franchise. You know what? We'll just leave it at that. 8 out of 10. Anyway, I really am dying here, so let's wrap this up. Wildermyth from World Waker Games. For those who are unfamiliar with it, it's a turn-based tactical fantasy game with a papercraft art style. I think that's right. broken up into a series of disconnected but story-driven, Fable-like scenarios. The really unusual thing is that throughout a single campaign, characters will get older and be changed both mentally and physically by the adventures that they experience, the people they meet, and the friends they lose. I love the concept of characters who evolve and change naturally over time like that, especially when it helps breathe life into these otherwise sort of blank slate custom characters. It really helps the player get more invested in their otherwise generic, disposable cannon fodder. I cannot overstate this. I love this game. I did that really casual gameplay series with the first EA build a long time ago, and I have been looking for an excuse to come back to it ever since then. While the art style certainly takes some getting used to, I really do think it's a fantastic game, and it's one that I still tend to revisit pretty frequently in my spare time. They're actually hitting full launch sometime in the very near future, and I certainly would not mind revisiting it for more videos. Moving on. Oh, and rounding out our list, though this isn't actually the full list I prepared. I've been culling some of the lower priority titles as we've been going along to save time, is Xenonauts 2 from Goldhawk Interactive. That one is essentially a modern remake of the classic XCOM UFO Defense, not to be confused with the Firaxis reimagining, but with some extra modern twists. The developers decided it was not ready to be unleashed on the public just yet, so it's once again being pushed back. This is a solid medium priority on my watch list because, while I do admire their dedication towards creating a more faithful adaptation of the original XCOM, it's also not really breaking any new ground. Doubly so, since from what I have gathered, Xenonauts 2 is basically just going to be an expanded and improved version of Xenonauts 1, which itself was essentially just a remake of the original XCOM. Exception? For now, it is a non-issue. Just as in the past months, it remains locked in a closed private beta I do not have access to, with the public early access build regularly getting shuffled farther and farther down the road. That's fine though. I feel like this is one of those games where, while I would like to do something with it eventually, there's no real rush to take advantage of launch hype or anything like that. I might do a couple of casual gameplay vids or something when they do eventually release that public beta, but I don't think I'd do anything serious with it until the full launch comes out. And that finally gets us through the bulk of my current watch list. So let us hastily bring this rambling to a close. Like I said, this was only actually about half my current watch list. I trimmed out a lot of the lower priority titles before we even got started, and then even more as we were going along when I realized how long this was running. But if you guys like hearing me ramble about a bewildering assortment of obscure upcoming indie games, then feel free to let me know in the comments below. I've got more than enough to fill out another retro or two, especially if I do not make those an hour long. Likewise, if you have any CRPGs, strategy games, or tactical games that you have not heard me mention, but think I might be interested in, feel free to suggest them. I'm always happy to check out new and potentially interesting games or projects. I might not actually have enough time to make videos about more than a tiny fraction of these titles, but I still like looking into them, and I still end up playing most of them anyway. At any rate, let's wrap this up with a quick round of thanks. Thank you to you, the viewers, for supporting the channel. It might not seem like much, but as always, every single view, comment, like, or sub does add up. The channel's growth tends to ebb and flow over time, usually based on the hype levels of whatever games we happen to be playing. But the important thing is that we are still growing, even if it is just in incremental amounts from one month to the next. I'm also happy to say that while the channel hasn't been tremendously successful, it has been successful enough that, along with some other supplemental income from secondary sources, I have been able to make ends meet, despite current events. Ideally, I would like the channel to be more successful, but I'm also stubborn and just refuse to do most of the things that YouTube tells me I should be doing to be more successful, so that's more my problem than theirs. And, of course, a huge round of thanks and applause goes out to the Raiders, the fine folks who help support the channel financially through PayPal and Patreon. They actually provide a lot more consistent income for me than YouTube does. Because with YouTube, the revenue can swing by as much as 40 or 50% from one month to the next, which makes it hard to budget around. It's thanks to the Raiders that I can check out a lot of these new games and back so many intriguing new crowdfunding projects. It's also thanks to them that I have been able to pamper my cats with fancier food and new toys to play with. Oh, and of course, it sometimes also pays for things like electricity and food and other stuff that I need so I don't die in the cold vacuum of space or get eaten by swamp mutants, so, you know, that's nice too. That said, special thanks to the honorary raiders from, well, let's just call it Q2 2021. A Dragon 707, Alexander Hawkbaum, Austin Fagan, Benjamin Gray, BGBNG, Bose 77, Brad Quinn, C1s, Commissar Moody, Comrade Robot, CRXCRVS, Ego 2, Ethan Vonderweed, Flamebeard, ICU Uwu, Mark Giemza, Mark Richards, Matt Lietzen, Maximilian Monk, Misha, Neurolancer, Olive Hope, Peter Clayson, Rob H., Roman Berger, Scott Brown, Sir Dialot, Stoltz, The White Winter Wolf, and Yvreth. And extra special thanks to the veteran raiders from Q2 2021. Adri Raven, Aloise, Andrew Steele, Ash, Dragon Matrix 7, Drakith, Erie version 23, Eric Teichmiller, James Tremiere, Jace Orkblood, Kazorm, Lady Shayna, Laura and Mike, Leroy Nukinson, Lulalu, Lake Nashender, Nolo Conte, Nerd Professor, Nod Goblin Nico, Optimal 2, Raximus Savage, Sean Orpin, Terry Williams, The Link King, The Book Thief, Thomas K. Arata, Thomas Pietkowski, Vertigo 322, Victoria Babenko, and Woe77. And of course, special mention to the mysterious Raider Elite, Lord Revenant, A Nerd in Warpaint, Antonio Hernandez, Excelsior, Ice Storm Shadow, Nathan Welch Jr., and Valenrook. These are all the folks who have gone above and beyond, and I am perpetually humbled by their generosity. I know that no Raider is ever going to end up sticking around forever, and some may rise and fall in the ranks over time, which is fine. But rest assured, I am forever grateful to every person who has ever enjoyed my videos enough to feel it's worth actually spending money on. As always, if you would like to join the illustrious ranks of the Retcon Raiders, feel free to check out the links to my Patreon and PayPal accounts in the description below. This is, of course, still a small channel, so the vast majority of any pledges or donations I receive tend to go right back into overhead or costs associated with running the channel, including staying alive. In return, while I can't offer much, aside from continuing to be alive and continuing to make more videos, I do offer some budget-friendly perks like shoutouts, access to exclusive polls and rambling blog posts over on Patreon, preferential placement on any recruitment or waiting lists I happen to put together. It's been a while, but they are going to happen. And the occasional sneak peek at any videos that I happen to finish early. I will admit that hasn't happened as much as I'd like lately, but I'm working on it. And with that, we are done. Thanks for watching. I'm gonna go die now. I will see you next time. Oh, and remember, if you need to contact me for some reason, feel free to leave a comment on any one of my videos, or you can reach me on Discord, Facebook, Patreon, Twitter, or my official email address. Links are in the description. Ellie, why are you making all that noise? Why are you making all that noise with your toys?